drugs, trade, empire. Three words that shaped the fate of modern Asia. But this isn't about gangs or black markets. This is about the British Empire, one of the most powerful nations in history, deliberately using addiction as a tool of war and profit. It's a story of how China, a self-sufficient superpower, was brought to its knees not by armies or invasions, but by narcotics. This is the dark history of the Opium Wars, when Britain forced drugs on China to control its economy, its sovereignty, and its future. In the late 18th century, China stood as a giant in global affairs. Under the Qing Dynasty, it boasted a thriving economy, a massive population, and a culture rooted in thousands of years of tradition. Western powers were fascinated and frustrated. The British, in particular, were obsessed with Chinese tea. By the 1700s, tea drinking had become a national obsession in Britain. But there was a catch. China didn't want anything the British had to offer. Chinese exports, tea, silk, porcelain, were in high demand in Europe. British imports? Not so much. The result? A massive trade imbalance. Silver flowed out of Britain and into China. The British treasury was draining, and the East India Company, the empire's economic engine, was desperate for a fix. So they found one: opium. Opium, derived from poppy plants, had been used for centuries as a medicinal drug. But in large quantities, it was a highly addictive narcotic. And Britain had access to plenty of it, grown and harvested in British-occupied India. By the late 1700s, British merchants began smuggling opium into China in exchange for silver, then using that silver to buy tea. It was a perfect triangle: grow in India, smuggle to China, profit in London. But the human cost? Catastrophic. Opium addiction exploded across China. Millions of citizens, from peasants to bureaucrats, became dependent on the drug. Entire communities collapsed under the weight of addiction. Crime rose. Productivity plummeted. Families were torn apart. The Qing government watched in horror as its society unraveled. And by the early 1800s, they'd had enough. In 1839, the Chinese emperor appointed Lin Zexu, a respected scholar and moral reformer, to crack down on the drug crisis. Lin didn't waste time. He arrested over 1,700 dealers, seized over £2.6 million of opium, and destroyed it in a public spectacle in the port city of Canton. He also wrote a powerful letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her sense of morality. Why do you not allow opium to be used in your own country, yet force it upon ours? There was no reply. Instead, Britain sent warships. In 1840, British gunboats arrived on Chinese shores, launching what would become known as the First Opium War. It was not a fair fight. China, still relying on outdated weapons and military tactics, was no match for Britain's modern navy and artillery. British forces bombarded ports, captured cities, and blockaded rivers. Chinese troops were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and humiliated. By 1842, China was forced to surrender and sign the Treaty of Nanjing, a treaty so unequal and humiliating it reshaped East-West relations for a century. Under the treaty, China was forced to pay Britain a massive indemnity in silver, open 5 major ports to British merchants, grant Britain most favored nation status, and, most devastatingly, the Chinese were forced to legalize the opium trade. Britain had effectively fought a war to force drug sales, and won. But it wasn't over. Over the next decade, British merchants continued flooding China with opium, while France and the United States demanded similar privileges. When China attempted to push back again, Britain struck once more. In 1856, the Second Opium War began, this time with both Britain and France teaming up against the Qing Dynasty. The Opium Wars marked the beginning of what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation. A period of foreign domination, internal rebellion, and rapid decline. In the decades that followed, China faced further invasions, unequal treaties, and a growing sense of national shame. It would take over a century, and a revolution, to recover. Meanwhile, Britain's opium-fueled victory set a dangerous precedent. It showed that empire could be built not just with bullets or flags, but with addiction. Some British politicians, writers, and missionaries condemned the wars as immoral and brutal. The idea of profiting from human misery was too much, even for Victorian sensibilities. But these voices were drowned out by the roar of empire and the clink of silver. And while Britain eventually banned opium domestically, it continued pushing it abroad for decades. The consequences of the Opium Wars still echo today. Modern China's distrust of the West? Even today, the memory of the Opium Wars is alive in Chinese education, media, and politics. Monuments stand where the imperial palaces were burned. Museums showcase the treaties, the weapons, and the opium pipes that symbolized a nation betrayed. And in Hong Kong, once ceded by treaty, later returned in 1997, the scars of colonialism remain fresh. This story challenges everything we're taught about empire, about progress, about the so-called civilizing mission of the West. It reminds us that sometimes, the most devastating weapons don't explode. They enslave, quietly, chemically, and for profit. China didn't fall to an army. It fell to addiction. And Britain didn't bring civilization. It brought opium. When we talk about historical accountability, about reparations, about why nations still carry centuries-old wounds, we must remember stories like this. Not just for the sake of history, but for justice. Because what happened in the Opium Wars wasn't just a war crime. It was a heist of a nation's soul. And the world is still living with the consequences.